Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching Configuring SRM. In this lesson, we will pair the protected SRM site with the recovery SRM site and then install the SRM license key. We will configure the array managers to allow SRM to talk with the storage replication software. We'll configure inventory mappings to match folders, resource pools, and other virtual resources from the protected site to the recovery site. We'll also create a protection group to identify which VMs are protected by SRM. We'll create a recovery plan to define how the protected VMs will be restored in a failover or in a disaster recovery test. Finally, we'll test the recovery plan to verify all pieces are working correctly. Are you ready? Great! Then let's let the fun begin. We are now ready to pair the protected site with the recovery site, or as it is also called, establishing reciprocity between the sites. But first, it's a good idea to review that we have our prerequisites covered. You'll want to make sure that the SRM server has been installed at each site. We'll also want to make sure that the SRA is installed on each SRM server as well. Again, that's the piece that allows SRM server to talk to the supported storage replication. We'll also want to have the SRM plugin installed into the vSphere client that you plan to use to configure the SRM configurations at each site. Once you have checked off that the prerequisites are all in order, we'll first begin with the protected site and pair it with the recovery site. Second, we'll pair the recovery site back with the protected site. And then finally, we'll install the SRM license key before we forget that piece. For the case of this lesson or for your own lab purposes, you don't need to worry about that since you can use the evaluation key from VMware. Okay then, let's jump right into the demo. We're ready to pair up the protected site with the recovery site now. In order to do that, we've logged in to the protected site's vCenter server with the vSphere client. And this is a vSphere client that has the site recovery plugin installed. We're going to go ahead and click on the home to get to the home screen here, and then click on the site recovery plugin. Once we're here, we can kind of orientate ourselves a little bit to make sure we're on the right site. As you can see at the top here, we have local site and we have paired site. Local site has the name protected VC, and the site name's protected site. So that's good. We wanted to start at the protected site, and we've just verified that we can do that. We can also tell that this is unpaired, so we have not established reciprocity, as it's called, yet. So let's go ahead and do that. The rest of this work will be done in the protection setup area here in the middle. We're actually just going to take care of the connection step with this brief demo. To do so, go ahead and click Configure. It's asking us for the URL for the recovery site vCenter server, which we'll go ahead and enter, and then click Next. This is a vCenter server certificate, so it's the default certificate that came with the vCenter server installation at the recovery site. Go ahead and accept that. Then it's asking for an account with administrative credentials at that remote server. We'll go ahead and enter that now. And now you'll notice that the title for this is a little bit different. This is the Validate Site Recovery Manager certificate. So SRM server at the recovery site also comes with its own default certificate as well, which we'll need to accept in order to continue. You'll notice a lot of green check marks there as we go down all the steps it takes in establishing reciprocity. One more time, it's asking us to log into the vCenter server. Go ahead and enter that one more time, then click Finish. Everything's working, and we should see that there's a paired site entered in there. Great. We're going to go ahead and do this on the recovery site, but first I'd like to install the SRM license key so that we don't forget that later, or at least show you where you can do it. Within this SRM screen, what we want you to do is go ahead and find the site recovery option here in the tree and right click on that. Go ahead and choose Advanced Settings from the drop-down. From here you'll note that there is a licensing section that we can click on. You would simply then just cut and paste your license key provided to you from VMware within here and then go ahead and click OK. We don't need to do that since this is an eval copy, so we'll just move right ahead with configuring the recovery site connection. Okay, we're back at the recovery site now. You can see from the top here that we're logged into Recovery VC, which is where I want to be. Again, we'll go ahead and click on the Site Recovery plugin from the home screen, which will bring us in here for the first time. Since we've already done some pairing of the sites, it's asking for us to log back into the remote vCenter server. So we'll go ahead and do that. And we'll install that certificate. Click Ignore. These are the certificates from the other side's virtual center and the other side's vCenter server. That's all there is to it. All we had to do is come in here and verify that the recovery site was seeing the same thing that the protected site was. Since we're not going to be protecting anything on this site to go back the other way, we don't have to worry about configuring the connection here. I just wanted to come in and show you what it looked like, show you how there's certificates that you need to accept, and from there we'll be good to go. All right, we are now ready to configure the array managers. This is the component of SRM that talks to the underlying storage replication software. You will do this step after the protected and recovery sites have already been paired. But before I demonstrate the configuration of the array managers, here's a quick overview of what will be happening. We'll be providing SRM with the info needed to connect to the storage replication software via the SRA. SRM will also verify it can communicate with the storage arrays at both sites. It will also verify it can see replicated VMware data stores. To do this, you will not only need properly configured storage replication software, but you'll need at least one VM on the data store for SRM to recognize that it's there. Now that you've had a little teaser, let me show you how to configure the array managers. Okay, here we are. We're logged into the vSphere client on the protected site, and we've already logged into the SRM plugin and are ready to begin the configuration. Again, we'll be using the protection setup section as our guide, and we've already done the site pairing. We're now ready to tackle array managers, which it shows is not configured. Just to make sure we're at the right site, go ahead and take a look at local site. Again, we are on the protected VC, which is exactly where I want to be right now. So let's go ahead down to array managers and click configure. We'll want to click add to add a protected site array manager, and then enter in the information that you'll need for your particular storage replication. Once you've entered the information, go ahead and click Connect. After a brief moment, it should find the storage replication software that you're scanning for. If that looks correct, go ahead and click OK and continue. Good deal. Here's a key piece to understand. It has found a replicated array pair, which means it's found a volume, a VMFS data store to be specific, with a virtual machine on it that's being replicated. If this device count is saying 0, you've done something wrong either with the SAN installation or possibly with SRM. Most likely it's with the SAN installation, as I found in the making of this lesson. So make sure that's one or more, and then go ahead and click Next. This is where you'll enter the recovery site array manager. So go ahead and click Add and put in the information for that array. Once that's entered, go ahead and click Connect to connect into the recovery SAN. Good, we found it. Go ahead and click OK to continue on. Good, we get a green check mark, so we can not only see the recovery VSA, we can see the replicated devices. Before clicking Finish, let's go ahead and review the replicated data stores that we have. In this case, it's VMFS1. We only have one that's being replicated. In a production environment, you may have many. I'll go ahead and click Finish, and that's the end of configuring array managers. What are inventory mappings? Inventory mappings define what folders, networks, and resource pools the recovered virtual machines will be assigned to. You don't have to set up these mappings. They are optional, but you'll have to have a really good reason not to. I would plan on using them in most normal circumstances. If inventory mappings have been established for a site, you cannot override them by configuring protection of individual virtual machines. I'll show you what that means in a second. But at a high level, it means if you want to configure resource mappings for an individual VM, you can only do it if the site-wide mappings have not been set. So like you would see in a default setup, or if someone was to remove all the mappings manually. If you need to override these inventory mappings for a few members of a protection group, you'll need to use the vSphere client to connect to the recovery site. There you'll find what's called placeholder VMs or shadow VMs. I'll show you those in a second once we get to setting up protection groups. Basically, it's a shadow VM that's just the configuration file, and it's stored in a data store that's set up at the recovery site. And you can edit it and change its network and its default resource pool just like you can a normal VM. That being said though, the preferred method is to use resource pools and folders within the protected site's vSphere setup in order to organize your mappings in a more holistic way and not let your SRM configuration get overly complex and manually configured. Remember, a goal of SRM is to prevent complex, not create it. Let's keep your configuration simple, and future administrators will thank you for your design. To help assist with managing SRM protection and moving virtual machines in and out of protection groups or certain resource pools for certain mappings, PowerShell is really your friend here. There are many good scripts out on the web that could be leveraged to move VMs back and forth between these different inventory mappings. These scripts can help your SRM config stay much simpler and easier to execute in pressure situations like a disaster drill or an actual disaster. Well, now it's demo time. Let me show you how to actually configure inventory mappings. Okay, here we are again at the vSphere client, and again we're logged into the site recovery plugin, and we're connected to our local site, which is the protected site. Again, I always do a nice little sanity check, make sure I'm on the right page, and it's pretty much following the dots here under the protection setup section. We've done site pairing, we've done the array managers, we are now ready to do inventory mappings. So to get started, let's click Configure. Pretty simple and straightforward here. On the left you have protected site resources. I have one virtual network for my VMs. I have 3 resource pools. I have a cluster. And I don't have any virtual machine folders unfortunately, but we could have those in there and you would see them. So to get started, click on a resource that needs configuration. That will then highlight the configuration button over here. So we'll start with the VM network and click Configure. At the tree here, we're logged into the recovery VC, so this is the recovery site SRM setup. I'll expand those until I find my networks. I'm going to choose to use the DR network at the recovery site. And I'll go through on the cluster and configure that, mapping the cluster, which in this case I only have one, to the recovery cluster, which I only have one on there too. If you have multiple clusters, you could see where this would be important. Resource pool for servers. I'm going to make sure that that maps into, I don't have resource pools at the recovery site, so we'll just use the cluster, which is the default resource pool at the default level. We'll do that with the rest of these as well. You get the idea how we can map resources from one side to the other. Finally, virtual machine folders. Not really a folder, but it's the default root level folder for virtual machines, which is at the data center level. We'll configure that and map that to the recovery site. Good. We got rid of all the yellow question marks, or excuse me, exclamation points. If we click back on the summary tab, actually not summary, summary just says OK. We'll click on the site recovery root level with the exclamation or the lightning bolt. And under inventory mappings, we can see that it now says configured. We're good to go. That's all there is to configuring inventory mappings.
Okay, let's talk about protection groups. Protection groups organize VMs based on replicated data stores that they're stored in. SRM also uses a non-replicated data store to store placeholder VMs, sometimes called shadow VMs, that contain the settings needed to quickly recover protected virtual machines in a DR test or an actual failover operation. These placeholder VMs also help administrators on the recovery site to easily identify what VMs are protected by SRM. Before we jump into the demo for setting up protection groups, there are a few prerequisites to be aware of. You should make sure that you have paired your SRM sites and configured the array managers. You also need to make sure that you have configured valid inventory mappings to the recovery site resources needed for the VMs that are recovered. Also, as you're designing protection groups, it's a good idea to remember that you can also protect templates as well. This is a good SRM strategy to keep in your bag of DR planning tricks. You should consider redeploying these stateless VMs as an alternative to replicating many identical virtual machines. Examples of identical stateless virtual machines would be web servers, VDI workstations, terminal servers, things that maybe store an application, but the user data and configuration and critical business data is stored on a separate server that's being protected by other means. These stateless servers are all good candidates for redeploying from templates. Not only because they save on replication bandwidth to the recovery site, but it's also a practice that could be possibly leveraged within your production deployments to speed your ability to grow capacity as you need to add these servers. It can also help you stay up to date by simply redeploying servers with the latest updated software rather than updating a lot of identical servers in place. Another good point to think about with protecting templates with SRM is that it gets your business in the mindset of restoring operational capabilities and not just virtual machines. A big part of SRM is that we want to restore the ability for your IT department to service the rest of your business. Having templates available to create new servers for new purposes and whatnot can help your business continue to hit the ground running after a major disaster. Adding and removing VMs from a protection group basically comes down to the operations that move VMs in and out of VMware data stores. For example, if you want to add a VM to be protected, you'd simply storage vMotion it into a protected data store, or you could shut it down and do a cold migration, or possibly if it's a net new server, you could deploy from template into a protected data store. Once that's done, you can simply configure protection on the VM, which we'll show you in just a second. Likewise, if you need to remove protection from a VM, you're simply going to remove it from a data store and unconfigure the protection. Well, enough of the theory and background behind creating protection groups. Let's dive right in and create some protection groups. I'm remoted into the protected site server, and I have two vSphere clients open. One to log into the recovery site so that we can show you before and after and what's happening as we set up a protection group. As you notice here, I have two virtual machines. These are just for demo purposes. These are full out virtual machines. I could boot them up and show you that they're legit. What's going to be created here are the placeholder VMs, which we'll switch over to that in just a bit. But first I want to open up the vSphere client that's logged into the protected site. Again, we're here at the site recovery management screen, and to make sure we're at the protected site, just look at local site and you can see that, yes, we're at the protected site. So where have we come from? Again, we're under the protected setup, and we've done connections, which is pairing the sites or establishing site reciprocity. We have array managers configured. We have inventory mappings configured. Now let's do some protection groups. To do that, just go ahead and click Create next to the Protection Groups section. You'll give this a name. Could give it a description. I'm just going to click Next since it's my only protection group. We'd also want to select the data store that we're going to be protecting. In this case, I only have one. So I select it, and as you can see, there's 4 virtual machines contained on that. Go ahead and click Next. Now we want to choose the data store in which to store the placeholder VMs. If you remember from the previous theory slide, we talked about placeholder VMs or shadow VMs. They're simply a configuration file that stores the inventory mappings for the particular VMs. Go ahead and expand this tree to reveal the data stores that are available. I'm going to select the shadow VM data store, which was created specifically for this purpose. Once that's selected, go ahead and click Finish. And if I expand the tasks here, we'll see that it's starting to create some virtual machines. I'm going to switch views here to the recovery site, and you'll see that it's in the process of creating some virtual machines. They're all completed, and yeah, as you can see here, I have critical PC, critical server, test box 1 and 3. These are shadow VMs or placeholder VMs that were created for the purpose of SRM. If I switch back into the protected sites SRM view, we can see that protection for the virtual machines has finished, and I have one protection group that's been created. Up here in the tree on the left-hand side, under protection groups, I can also find the protection group critical servers. If I needed to edit this, I could edit or remove protection. There's the virtual machines. Protection has been configured for all of them. So if I go back to the Site Recovery Manager tree there, we can see that we are pretty much all set with the protection setup. The only thing left to do now is set up a recovery plan, which we'll do in just a second. All right, now for the fun stuff. It's time to create and test a recovery plan. We'll finally be able to see SRM in action at the end of this section. A recovery plan basically controls how virtual machines and a protection group are recovered at the recovery site. Recovery plans for VMs are based on the protection groups to which they belong, which basically comes down to the data store membership, wherever that VM is stored. A basic recovery plan includes a number of prescribed steps that are needed to bring up replicated VMs at the recovery site. These are presenting the latest replicated volumes to the recovery site ESX servers. The recovery plan also tells ESX to scan for these new LUNs and data stores and get them added so that the next step can happen, which is registering these protected VMs with the recovery site ESX servers. Also a good idea, and it's an option with your recovery plan, which is to free up resources. So to do that, we could suspend VMs that are running at the recovery site. These would be VMs like test and dev boxes, maybe for people getting around the policies. Maybe they're running World of Warcraft servers on that excess DR capacity. Whatever it is, it's a good idea to maybe free it up if you want to save money on DR resources or get value out of those DR resources by running test and dev. You can use SRM to automatically shut them down when you need that capacity. Also, the recovery plan will boot up virtual machines at the recovery site, which is the sole purpose of SRM. It's to boot up production workloads at a recovery site for the purpose of test or for the purpose of an actual failover, which we hope will never happen. Recovery plans can also be used to create a bubble network on the recovery site ESX servers. This bubble network is just a separate network that's created as needed for testing the recovered virtual machines. And those virtual machines will live within this bubble network, and so that they don't conflict with the other IP addresses on the network, so that production clients aren't accidentally accessing these restored test servers. It's an option for you to do SRM testing anytime you want without affecting production work. So with that little background, let's go ahead and begin the first test recovery of many to come. And I do mean many. One of the greatest reasons for pursuing SRM and setting it up within your environment is that it allows you to test your disaster recovery preparedness anytime you want without affecting production. So test, 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 get those DR plans ironclad without any errors, so that whenever you do need them, you're able to work efficiently and protect your business. With that, let's dive into the demo for creating and testing a recovery plan. Okay, here we are logged in to the recovery site with the vSphere client. You can see local site says recovery site, so we know we are controlling the recovery site's SRM server right now. There's really only one step that happens at the recovery site, and it's right here with the recovery setup. There is a protection setup, but that would be if we wanted to actually use this as the protected site and replicate back to the other site. We're going to keep this very simple, and we're going in one direction only, from protected to recovery. So we're at the recovery site now. You don't have to confuse this with a more complicated setup, although you're free to do that with SRM. So with that, let's set up a recovery plan, which is the only option we have here for recovery setup. Go ahead and click on Create and give it a name. Once you've given it a name, go ahead and click Next. As mentioned earlier, recovery plans are for protection groups. So we only have one here, so we'll select it now. And click Next. I'm going to accept the defaults for VM response time. You could change this if your environment dictates. Safest bet is to stick with the default of 600 seconds. This is where we set up the networks that would be mapped in the event of a test. I'm going to go ahead and just leave it at auto, although if you had special virtual networks that you needed mapped to in the event of a test, you would specify them there. Since this is a single server environment, it's not really a problem to do auto and just let the bubble network get created as needed for testing. So we'll go ahead and click next, basically accepting the defaults for now. As far as suspending local machines, I have two that could be running. They're not running now, but tell you what, I'll start them up to demonstrate how this works. We'll go ahead and select both of them. The rest of these virtual machines are, as you can see, recovery VMs. So these are the placeholder VMs. It's easy to see the difference. But yeah, like I said, I'll check those two so that they can be suspended, demonstrating how we can save resources. When I'm done with that, I clicked finish and we're done. That created a recovery plan very quickly. And if I click on that, we can see we have a number of virtual machines. That are going to be recovered and when we test this or actually do a failover. We also have a new screen called Recovery Steps, which if you want to see exactly what is happening throughout the recovery process, we'll be looking in this window. Before I do that though, I'm going to go ahead and start up those virtual machines so we have some machines here to play with and to automatically shut down. These are just small virtual appliances you can download from the VMware Virtual Appliance Marketplace. These are basically DOS virtual machines. They're very small, take up very small amounts of memory, and they make a good test case when working in a lab like this. So now that they're running, I'll go to Site Recovery, click on my recovery plan, which I've already done. And up top I have two options, Run and Test. Run is the red button. You will only hit this in the event of a true failover. We're only going to do test right now since that's non-disruptive to production and we'll bring up our virtual machines in a bubble network. So I'm going to go ahead and click test. Testing this recovery plan may take several minutes. Do you want to continue? Of course I do. So I'll go ahead and click yes. And I'll expand this window just a little bit so you can see what's happening down below with the status. Rescanning HBAs, preparing storage for test. As you can also see up here in the recovery steps, it gives you a real-time view as to what is being automated by SRM. At this moment, we're preparing storage and attaching the disks to the recovery site ESX servers. So this is where SRM is talking to this storage replication adapter, which in turn talks to the SAN and basically gets the latest snapshot of a protected data store and is presenting that to the ESX servers. You might wonder why these first steps under step number 1 were skipped over. It's because we're doing a test. These red steps are really only done if you're doing a true failover, which is actually clicking the red button for run, what was the red button. It's important to do those in a failover situation if you needed to actually shut down the production site so that you don't have conflicts on the network. Because if you're doing a failover, you're not going to be using the bubble network. You're now going to be restoring the actual virtual machines. So here's a key piece to talk about. We can see that storage has been presented. We've attached the disks to the protection group. That's great. We've suspended non-critical virtual machines. So if I switch around to hosts and clusters view, I can see that game server and the Nostalgia VM have both been suspended. Also, if we look into inventory data stores, we can see that there's an additional VMFS data store that's been added. This is a snapped version of the VMFS. It's easy to see that it's not the actual VMFS 1 data store that was in the protected site. So that's good. If I switch then back to site recovery, we'll follow along here as it looks like it's beginning to recover the servers that were replicated. What we're probably waiting for at this moment is for VMware tools within each of the recovered virtual machines to become active and begin to signal back to the recovery site's virtual center that it's awake and ready to go. And SRM will actually be listening for that as well. That's going to be the sign for it to know that, yep, these virtual machines have started. It's time to proceed with the next steps in our list of recovery plan steps. If I expand one of those particular steps for recovering a VM, you can see exactly what was happening the whole time. Change network settings, pre-power on steps if needed, power on, wait for OS heartbeat, post power on. Now I'm probably going to have a problem here with test box 1, test box 3. That has to do with the fact that we're waiting for an OS heartbeat. That will probably never happen. It's because it's a DOS machine, so there's no VMware tools inside of that. Okay, now we can see that the timeout has finally happened. The timeout is set to 600 seconds as far as how long SRM will wait for a guest OS heartbeat from the VMware tools to take off. Since test box 1 and test box 3 don't have VMware tools installed, since they're basically DOS virtual appliances, we had to wait 10 minutes. So to the magic of video editing, we were able to get right to this next spot, which is kind of a break. It's just a message that's been inserted into the procedure here to verify that the test recovery had worked. We're going to actually do what it says here, which is verify that the test was successful. Well, to do that, let's take a look at the virtual machines. If I go to hosts and clusters, I will see that I do have 4 virtual machines up and running. This one right here is test box 3. It's a open the console to verify that it's indeed ready to go, and it is. It's ready for us to select an option there. That's not terribly important. For me, what's important is taking a look at the critical PC. Okay, you can see that we've logged into the critical PC here, and I'm going to enter in an account that can test whether recovery was successful or not. So this is an XP computer. This could basically represent your VDI infrastructure possibly, or maybe your virtual desktop infrastructure. That would be a critical asset to protect in a disaster. But basically what I have is start menu, and we'll go to my computer where we can access a critical file share that has been mapped into this virtual desktop. This file share is running off of critical server, which was another VM that was restored with the test plan here. So let's go ahead and open up this Z drive, which is critical file share on critical server. And I have a critical file here, which is the answer to the ultimate question of life, universe, and everything. Let's make sure that this is protected and correct. And yep, it's been protected. The answer is 42. So any fans of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe will get the joke here. So yeah, we've tested recovery. We've tested that our critical PC recovered correctly, and that the file share
contained on critical server could also be accessed. So I'm going to say that this recovery was a success. Oh, lost connection. We'll have to go ahead and log back into SRM. That's all right. That happens from time to time. We'll go back to home, click on site recovery. And since we've verified that this is a success, we'll go ahead and click continue so that the rest of the SRM test can happen, which is basically the cleanup, which is removing the virtual machines that were restored. It will then resume the function of the virtual machines that were suspended during the test. And then the final pieces are actually resetting the storage, which is taking that snapshot that was presented to the recovery site ESX servers. It will, in lack of better words, unpresent it, so remove it from the recovery site. And that's it. That's all there is to setting up a recovery plan and testing it. A quick go back to hosts and clusters so you can see that the protected servers that were tested and restored have now been shut down, and they're back to their normal state, which is that of a placeholder VM. The game server and nostalgia server are back on. Those are the VMs that were running prior to the test. So we'll assume that this all goes to plan and that the site recovery manager finishes the test and puts the storage back in its original state. Well, that about does it for this lesson on configuring SRM. But before you go, I'd like to review some of the key terms that were introduced in this lesson because you'll continue to hear them throughout this video. The first is that of a placeholder VM. Now this is a virtual machine that's used at the recovery site to store the inventory mappings for individual protected VMs. And this is useful for signifying to SRM admins exactly which virtual machines are protected. This isn't a full copy of the virtual machine. Actually, it's only the configuration, so it's very small and requires only a small data store to live on. The second term is reciprocity. This is another way of saying connecting of SRM sites, or the pairing of a protected site with a recovery site. The third is array managers. The SRM configuration connecting SRM to the storage replication software via the SRA, or storage replication adapter. This is the array manager. Inventory mappings are the relationships of protected site virtual resources, such as folders, networks, and resource pools, with those at the recovery site. We also covered protection groups, which is groups of virtual machines that are stored on replicated data stores and configured for recovery by SRM. And finally, the recovery plan is the steps needed to recover the protected VMs at the recovery site. All right, well, that wraps it up for this lesson on configuring SRM. But before you go, I'd like to review what we learned in this lesson. First off, we learned how to create site pairs, or what's also known as establishing reciprocity between the protected site and the recovery site. We also installed the SRM license at the protected site SRM server after that moment. Then we learned how to configure the array managers, or this is the part that uses the storage replication adapter to allow SRM to communicate to the storage replication software. Then we learned how to configure inventory mappings, mapping virtual machine folders, virtual networks, and resource pools from the protected site to the recovery site. We then learned how to create protection groups to protect virtual machines that are stored on protected data stores. Protected data stores are replicated SAN volumes between the protected site and the recovery site. We then had to find a way to recover those virtual machines, so we created a recovery plan at the recovery site, and this would establish the order and the resources and the priority for restoring virtual machines to that recovery site. And finally, most importantly, we learned how to test a recovery plan. I can't say it enough, but I think that's the most important piece of this SRM software and how to use it, and one of its best capabilities. This is the fact that you can test your disaster recovery plan anytime you want and as often as you need to. Well, that does it for this lesson on configuring SRM. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.